In the spring of 1904, Robert Bob Wetter was accused of murdering two fellow prospectors, Christian L. Long and Claud Wahn, deep in the mountains of Washington state. The story he told led everyone to believe he was insane. Those who believed him never again ventured into the area where the killings took place. His account of what happened, as was told to Judge P.L. Payne, was shocking and gruesome. This is a story as was passed down from Judge P.L. Payne to his kin, then down through the generations. Judge Payne was always known to be a credible man. Christian and Claude were my fellow prospectors and friends. No one will ever believe the story I'm about to tell you, but it's what happened. I was there, and you were not. Neither was anyone else for that matter. I'm still in disbelief how I'm sitting here now telling you this, as I'm not sure how I myself made it out alive after what I saw with my own eyes. The rivers were unusually high this year due to the long, harsh winter which had brought a lot of snow. The three of us decided to head further into the mountains in search of good places to start panning, since we were unable to pan anyway until the rivers settled down. None of us had ever ventured as far as we did. On the first day we'd hiked all day with us on foot and the mules carrying our supplies. As it started to get dusk, we were tired and famished, so we decided to set up camp not too far from the river, but far enough the sound of the river wouldn't drown out the approaching sound of unwanted guests that may want to enter our camp while we slept. Once we'd finished setting up camp, Claude said he was going down to the river to fetch some water to make coffee later. He'd been gone for a spell when we heard him shouting, "Bob, Christian, get down here, now." We both dropped what we were doing and took off running towards the area we'd seen him head towards. It was still light enough, mind you, but getting close to dark, so we had to make sure as we ran we were careful not to get hurt. Once we made it to the top of the riverbank, we looked down and could see him standing there, shaking with fear, still holding the bucket. "What are you going on about, Claude?" I asked. He slowly turned his head around, looking back at me, and said, "As I came down the riverbank, I saw something. There were several of them. They quickly jumped into the river and disappeared when they saw me. I swear, they looked almost like small children, and they were light in color." Christian and I both bursted out laughing. "That's nonsense. They were probably just some bear cubs. Let's go back to camp. It's getting late and I'm hungry," I said. As Claude slowly made his way up the bank, he said, "They weren't bear cubs. I know the difference." I noticed he was still shaking. It was clear to me something had definitely spooked him. Seeing him like that did make me a little nervous, but I was still convinced at the time it was bear cubs he saw. As we sat around the fire that night, Christian and I did most of the talking as Claude sat there in silence. I took note of it, but thought he was overreacting. We'd seen plenty of bears in all sorts of colors over the years, so I wasn't sure why this one in particular had him so riled up. Rest assured, though, I slept with my rifle loaded next to me that night. We awoke the next morning as the sun crested the mountaintops, packed up our essentials, and continued heading deeper into the mountains. We hiked all day following the river, only stopping when needed. We were more tired than the previous day, so we decided to stop and set up camp earlier. Again, we kept the same distance from the river as the previous day. This time, Christian said he'd go fetch the water. As he said that, I could see Claude breathe a small sigh of relief. As we ate dinner around the fire that night, Claude seemed to be in better spirits, which was good. We were 2 days' ride back to the nearest town, so losing your wits about you out here can be dangerous. The next morning, I remember opening my eyes and seeing smoke from the fire's ashes rising up into the cool morning air. We each slept several feet apart at night, with me being in the middle that night. I remember rolling over to my left and could see Claude was on his side with his back to me. "Good morning, gents," I said as I sat up. "Morning, Bob," Christian replied as he was trying to wake up. Claude was silent, which I assumed at the moment he was still sleeping. A few minutes went by, and I noticed Claude hadn't moved at all. I looked closer at him, and something seemed off. It took me a bit, but as I looked down at his feet, I noticed they were missing. I immediately jumped up, thinking I must be seeing things that were not right. I quickly ran over to him, grabbed him by the shoulder, and shook him as I said, "Claude, are you all right?" His body rolled over, and to my horror, I could see his hands were missing as well. They'd been severed off. I jumped back and screamed out, "Christian, get over here, now. Something's happened to Claude." He came running over. "What the hell is going on? Where are his hands and feet?" he said when he saw what I saw. Right then, I noticed a long slit up his belly that started from his groin and went up to the bottom of his breastbone. I knelt down beside him and said, "Claude, what happened to you, my friend?" As I knelt there, grieving, I could see through the slit. His insides had been removed. I looked back at Christian and said, "His insides are gone. What would have done this?" "I don't know, but we need to head back to town and get the sheriff," replied Christian. I stood up, quickly went over to my things, and started putting them into the panniers so we could leave, when suddenly Christian said, "Bob, get back over here and look at this." I dropped what I was doing and ran back to Christian's side. He was looking down at something on the ground with a confused, fearful look on his face. It took me a bit to see what he was staring at, but when I saw it, I was also confused. On the ground were dozens of little footprints all around Claude's dead body. They looked like the footprints of small children. I knelt down to get a closer look and couldn't believe what I was seeing. "All of these footprints have 6 toes. These can't be the footprints of children," I said. "Let's get out of here now," said Christian as he started backing away from Claude's body. "Yes, let's get the hell out of here," I replied. We both quickly gathered up our belongings and proceeded to follow the river that would lead us out of the mountains. We moved down the mountain as fast as we could, being we had the mules heavily loaded down with gear. We would have left our gear at the campsite with Claude's body, but we needed it, being it was a 2-day trek to town. We hiked until dark that day before deciding to set up camp. Moving during night, even with lanterns, was not wise. The forest was thick, and we couldn't risk getting the mules or ourselves injured. One wrong step could send us tumbling down the mountain. Once we set up camp, we both went down to the river to fetch water. Back at camp, we gathered up a good amount of wood and made a big fire we could keep going all night. We had lanterns, but wanted to conserve our oil in case we might need it later. Whatever killed Claude was still out there, and we were both scared senseless we might be next. After dinner, we were extremely tired and knew we were going to struggle staying awake. Our plan was to sit back to back with rifles in hand should something come in. As we sat there next to the fire, we talked for a while about various things, not only to try and take our minds off of what had happened, but to also keep ourselves awake. The next thing I remember was being awakened to a grunting sound and Christian slightly moving behind me. "Christian, are you all right?" I asked. It was then I heard what sounded like the murmuring of small children. It was more like sounds than words being spoken. He then fell over on his side. I quickly jumped up, sending my rifle flying a few feet in front of me. I ran over, picked it up, and quickly turned around. The fire was almost out, but I could see enough to see him laying on his side. "Christian, answer me. Are you all right?" I asked again. Fear surged through me as I looked down at his feet and could see they were not there. My mind began racing as I thought about what I should do. I wasn't sure what time it was, and I certainly didn't want to wait there until morning. I thought about checking his body, but knew it wouldn't help anything. I knew what had happened. I made the decision right then to get out of there, following more closely to the river this time in hopes it would help make the trek out a little safer, being it was dark. I lit up my lantern, grabbed my mule Sarah, and proceeded to walk towards the river. Once I was next to the river, I took a deep breath and slowly started following it down. I was rightly scared out of my mind at this point. Every sound would make me turn around to see if something was behind me. It was very dark that night, the darkest I could ever remember. There was no moon, and it was as if the stars had left the sky. I'd been hiking for a spell when suddenly in front of me I heard the faint sound of whispering, then what sounded almost like laughter, then the splashing sound of water. I froze in place, grabbed my rifle out of its scabbard and shouted, "Who's out there? Show yourself." I heard nothing except the continuous sound of the flowing river. Sarah then started stomping her feet on the ground and started whimpering. I grabbed her lead rope and tried calming her down. Little did she know I was as scared as she was. As I was rubbing her neck and talking to her, something suddenly leaped out of the river, grabbing Sarah by the back leg. She immediately started bucking and braying, which sent me flying backwards onto the ground. My rifle and lantern hit the ground, putting it out. I jumped up as I could hear Sarah continue braying, then loud sounds of splashing as she was quickly pulled into the river. Then she suddenly stopped. Instinct took over. I turned around and started running in the opposite direction of the river. As I ran, I repeatedly fell down and kept getting hit in the face with branches. I was in a lot of pain but didn't care. Fear kept me moving. I moved as quickly as I could, which wasn't very fast, being I was exhausted. It was dark, and the forest was thick. When first light came, it was a welcome sight. When I was able to get a clear view of the mountains, I didn't know exactly where I was, but had a general idea and knew I needed to head down the mountain, heading west. As I made my way down, I kept trying to figure out what the thing was that grabbed Sarah, and knew it must be the same thing that killed Claude and Christian. I knew for a fact, whatever it was not a bear or a mountain lion. I've witnessed a lot of predator attacks, and this was not that. Aside from that, the river was too deep and much too swift for a lion or bear to even be in it, much less maneuver around in it, dragging a full-size mule along with it. I hiked for 2 days before I made it to town, then came straight here to the sheriff's office. It was noted Bob was covered in blood when he came into the sheriff's office. The sheriff knew some of it obviously was Bob's blood. His face and arms were scratched up quite severely from running through the forest in the dark, but he mentioned to his deputies some of it might be Claude's and Christian's. He quickly organized a search party to go recover the bodies of Claude and Christian. They followed the river just like Bob instructed until they found their bodies. When the search party arrived back to town with their bodies, they were quiet and seemed to be disturbed and horrified by what they'd found. They were all interviewed, and each person corroborated Bob's story as far as what he said they'd find. Each member of the search party said they'd found the small footprints on the ground, all bearing 6 toes, around the gutted bodies of Claude and Christian, and in the mud along the river. They also found the panniers and gear floating in the river that Sarah the mule had been carrying, but never found her carcass. Claude's and Christian's mules were never recovered. Robert Bob Wetter was eventually accused of their murders and sentenced to be hanged. Before passing away, Judge P.L. Payne told one of his children that years after the incident, he told the story to a Yakama tribal elder. The elder was quiet for a while, then said, "That was the doing of the Managishi. They're a creature that lives in the water. They're small, hideous, malicious, and prefer eating the organs of humans. When the rivers run high, they're allowed to come out to feed." For more scary horror stories, please subscribe.